The sun was setting over the quiet little village, pouring golden light across the fields. The day had been hot, and the earth lay cracked and dry after weeks without rain. Children ran through the fields, chasing each other, their laughter carrying over the rustling grass. Among them was a young girl, no more than 8 years old, curious by nature, her small hands always busy turning over stones and collecting wildflowers. But this evening, her game was different. She had found a stick, sharp at one end, and decided she would dig. Not for anything in particular, simply because children dig when the world feels full of hidden treasures. She pressed the stick into the ground, chipping away at the dry soil, imagining she might uncover a coin, a toy left behind, or perhaps a secret box. After a few minutes of scraping, the tip of her stick hit something solid. She frowned, knelt down, and began digging with her hands. The earth crumbled under her nails, dust staining her palms. What she expected to be a rock soon revealed smooth edges, cool even in the heat of the day. The more she cleared, the more the shape began to form. A curve, a robe, a face. Her breath caught. It wasn't a rock at all. With all the determination her little arms could muster, she pulled harder, scraping away soil until at last the figure began to emerge. The head was bowed, the hands folded in prayer, the features serene. It was a statue of the Virgin Mary. For a moment, she just sat back on her heels, eyes wide, her stick discarded in the dirt. Dust clung to her hair and cheeks, but she hardly noticed. The statue was small enough for her to lift, yet heavy in her hands, weathered, worn by time, but untouched by decay. The girl stood, wobbling slightly, and held it up toward the fading sun. The light caught the stone in such a way that for a heartbeat it seemed to glow. She gasped, her mouth open in wonder. A boy nearby, still chasing after friends, stopped when he heard her. "What's that?" he called, curiosity pulling him closer. "It's Mary," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. Within minutes, other children had gathered, circling her in awe. Some reached out to touch it, others simply stared. Their games forgotten, they were drawn into a silence children rarely keep. An old farmer, working in the next field, noticed the unusual quiet and came over, wiping sweat from his brow. When he saw what the girl held, his face paled, his voice trembled. Where did you find this?" She pointed to the hole she had dug, her small hands still clutching the statue tightly. Word spread quickly. Soon, men and women left their homes, walking down the narrow dirt paths toward the field. A crowd formed, neighbors, elders, even the widow who always prayed alone in the old chapel. She pushed forward, her cane sinking into the dry soil, her eyes fixed on the statue as tears welled. "This statue," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand but not quite touching it. It was said to be lost. Long ago, when the old chapel collapsed in a storm, no one ever found it again. The villagers exchanged glances. Some crossed themselves, others muttered under their breath. But not everyone was convinced. A man with rough hands and a skeptical frown shook his head. "It's just stone, buried for years, maybe left behind by those before us. Don't turn children's games into fantasies." The little girl looked at him, then back at the statue, clutching it tighter. Though she didn't have the words, something deep inside told her it wasn't just stone. She had dug for fun, but what she found carried a weight she didn't understand. The widow stepped forward, her voice breaking but firm. "Child," she said softly, "you were chosen to find this. Do not let go." The air felt different then, heavy. The last rays of sun stretched across the field, landing squarely on the statue, as though the day itself bowed in reverence. No one moved, no one spoke. For the villagers, the image was unforgettable. A young girl, dusty and small, holding in her hands the Virgin Mary, unearthed from the silence of the soil. And though the field was quiet, though the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass, an unspoken question pressed into every heart. Why now? The girl did not know. None of them did. But as the sky turned from gold to purple, they all felt the same uneasy stirring. A sense that this discovery was not just chance, that what had been lost for decades had returned through the innocence of a child. And as the first star appeared above the horizon, a whisper moved through the crowd, soft but certain. "This is only the beginning." The crowd grew larger as word spread. By nightfall, almost the entire village had walked down the dusty paths that led to the field where the little girl stood with the statue in her hands. Some had lanterns, their flickering glow casting long shadows over the cracked earth. Others brought nothing but curiosity, whispering among themselves as they craned their necks to catch a glimpse of what the child had unearthed. The girl sat cross-legged on the ground now, the statue balanced carefully in her lap. Her hands were dirty, streaked with soil, but she clutched the figure as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The Virgin's face, though worn and weathered, carried a serenity that seemed untouched by time. The old widow was the first to kneel. Her name was Isabella, a woman whose back was bent from years of labor and whose eyes, though clouded, still carried a fire. With trembling fingers, she reached toward the statue, but stopped just shy of touching it. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "I prayed to her when I was a girl," she said softly, staring at the folds of the Virgin's robe. "Back when the old chapel stood near the river, there was a statue just like this at the altar. They said it had been brought from Spain, carried across the sea by men who believed it would protect this land." Her words carried through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs rising into a low hum. The chapel she spoke of had been gone for decades, destroyed in a storm that swept the valley. Many had assumed the statue had been washed away, lost forever. One of the men shook his head. "Isabella, you're old. Your memories are stories now, children's tales. This is just stone." The widow turned her gaze toward him, sharp despite her years. "Stone doesn't wait under the earth, untouched. Stone doesn't call to children." Her eyes returned to the little girl, who held the statue tighter. "She was meant to find it. Don't you see? She was meant to." The man scoffed, folding his arms. "You see miracles in everything. The ground dries up after rain. You call it a blessing. A bird sings. You call it a sign. This is no different. Let the child be. Don't make this into more than it is." But not everyone agreed. A young mother stepped forward, her baby wrapped against her chest. "If this statue was lost when the chapel fell," she said hesitantly, "then why now? Why here? Why would a child find it after so many years?" Her voice faltered. "It feels like a message." The girl looked up at them all, her small face streaked with dirt and sweat, her eyes wide but unafraid. She hugged the statue closer to her chest, as though the stone figure could hear her heart beating. "It's not just a statue," she said quietly, almost to herself. The villagers fell silent. It wasn't the authority of her words, but the purity of them, the certainty that only a child could carry. An old priest, Father Miguel, had been among the last to arrive. He leaned heavily on his cane as he stepped forward, his voice steady but heavy with memory. When the chapel was destroyed, he said, I was a boy. My mother carried me through the flood. I remember looking back and seeing the roof collapse. I thought the statue had been taken by the waters, lost to the river forever. He paused, his eyes on the Virgin's bowed head. But here she is, found not by priests nor by elders, but by a child. The crowd shifted again, the murmurs rising louder this time. Some crossed themselves, others looked away, afraid of what it might mean. One man spat into the dirt. Superstition. You cling to ghosts. The world changes and you stay behind, clutching rocks and shadows. Let the dead stay buried. But his voice was drowned out by another, a young boy who pointed to the statue's base. Look, he cried, his voice full of awe. She's not even dirty. The crowd leaned in. Despite being buried, the folds of her robe and the curve of her face seemed untouched by the years underground. Dust clung to the edges, but the stone itself looked almost polished, as though waiting to be revealed. Gasps rippled through the villages. Isabella closed her eyes, tears streaking down her wrinkled cheeks. When I was young, she whispered, I lit candles at her feet. I prayed for my father to come home safe from the mountains. And he did. I prayed for rain when the crops failed, and it came. She listened. She always listened. The little girl's voice rose suddenly, clear and small. She was waiting for me. Heads turned. The child's words struck like a spark in the darkness. Some shook their heads, uneasy with the weight of such innocence. Others simply stared, as though the truth was too obvious to deny. Father Miguel raised his hand for silence. His old eyes met the child's, then the statue's. Perhaps she was waiting, he said. His voice carried over the field, strong despite his frailty. Perhaps this is not the return of stone, but the return of faith. The villagers shifted, their emotions torn between belief and doubt. The skeptic from earlier barked a laugh. Faith? This is a child's game turned into spectacle. Tomorrow you'll see it's nothing. Just stone dug from the earth, nothing more. But even as he spoke, no one seemed to believe him. The weight in the air was too heavy, the silence too thick. Lanterns flickered, and the light seemed to cling to the Virgin's face, casting her in a gentle glow that no one could explain. The little girl laid the statue carefully on the ground before her, brushing away the last bits of dirt from its base. Then, without thinking, she folded her hands and bowed her head. One by one, others followed. The young mother, the farmer, even Father Miguel, lowering himself slowly to his knees. Isabella wept openly, her lips moving in prayer. And still, some stood back, arms crossed, unwilling to kneel. Their hearts were not ready. But whether they prayed or turned away, all of them knew one thing. Something had returned to their village that had been gone for a long, long time. The girl raised her head, her small voice breaking the silence once more. She came back because we forgot her. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling in the distance. The villagers did not answer, but many felt the sting of truth in her innocence. They had moved on. They had forgotten the chapel, the prayers, the faith of their parents and grandparents. And now a child had unearthed not just stone, but memory. The night grew darker, but no one left the field. They stayed, caught between doubt and wonder, between skepticism and longing. The statue lay at the center, silent but powerful, as though the Virgin herself were waiting for them to decide whether this was coincidence or calling. And in the quiet of that moment, even the doubters could not shake the question pressing against their hearts. Why here? Why now? The answer, though still hidden, seemed to stir in the wind that moved across the field. The next morning, the village awoke with whispers still echoing from the night before. The little girl's discovery had traveled fast, faster than any gossip, faster even than the merchants who carried news from town to town. Farmers setting out into the fields carried lanterns not for work, but to see the hole where the statue had been uncovered. Mothers brought their children, pointing toward the figure with hushed voices, some reverent, others doubtful. The statue had been placed carefully on a flat stone at the edge of the field, surrounded by the loose earth the girl had dug away. It looked strangely dignified there, as though it had chosen the spot itself. The little girl, hair still tangled from sleep, stood watch nearby. Her small face carried a seriousness beyond her years. She had not let the statue out of her sight all night, dozing off with her head resting beside it. Those who came closer gasped when they noticed something unusual. Despite being buried for decades, the stone figure bore no cracks, no stains, no moss. Even the folds of her robe looked as though they had been carved yesterday. The only marks were the faint scratches left by the child's stick as she scraped the earth away. "How can it be so clean?" one villager murmured, kneeling to inspect it more closely. "Stone doesn't rest in dirt and come out shining." "It's been waiting," Isabella, the old widow, said softly from where she leaned on her cane. Her eyes glistened with fresh tears. "Waiting for the right hands." Others scoffed. "Nonsense," one man barked. "Stone doesn't wait. It doesn't choose. It's just what it is. Maybe the soil preserved it. Maybe it's luck. Don't make this into a story." Yet even he could not explain what they saw next. At the very place where the girl had dug, where the ground had been cracked and lifeless for weeks without rain, a patch of green had begun to spread. Tiny shoots pushed through the dry earth, impossibly fresh, and in the middle of it, a cluster of small wildflowers had appeared overnight. Their petals swayed gently, though the air was still. Gasps rose from the crowd. Mothers clasped their hands to their mouths. A boy bent down to touch one, then pulled back quickly as though it might burn him. "Flowers don't grow overnight," someone whispered. "Not here. Not now." The skeptic shook his head firmly, though his voice faltered. "Seeds. There must have been seeds in the soil, waiting for moisture. That's all. A trick of nature." But there had been no rain. The earth all around remained dry, cracked, lifeless. Only here, where the statue had been found, did color bloom. The girl bent down and touched the flowers gently, her fingers brushing the soft petals. Then she turned to the crowd with wide eyes. "She's smiling at me." Some laughed nervously, shifting their weight. Others grew silent, staring at the child. "What do you mean?" Father Miguel asked, stepping forward slowly. The girl's voice was small but steady. "In my dreams. Last night. She came to me. She was smiling, like a mother smiles when you've come home. She didn't say words, but I knew." The widow Isabella sobbed quietly into her shawl. The Mother of Mercy does not need words. Her smile is enough. But not everyone was ready to believe. A younger man, arms crossed, glared at the girl. "Dreams are dreams. You fill her head with nonsense, and she sees what you want her to see. Don't make a child your prophet." The girl shook her head quickly. "No one told me. No one. I saw her." She looked down at the statue again, her small hands pressed together in an awkward imitation of prayer. "She's alive." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Some avoided her gaze, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. Others felt their hearts stir with a longing they hadn't known in years. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, a group of villagers lingered near the field. Some knelt before the statue, leaving candles that flickered bravely against the wind. Others simply stood, watching from a distance, unwilling to step too close. The air carried an energy that unsettled them, part fear, part hope, part something beyond words. One woman leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "First the statue, now the flowers, now dreams. How many signs before we stop calling it coincidence?" Her neighbor frowned, staring at the Virgin's stone face, lit softly by the candles. "Or how many before we realize we're fooling ourselves?" The tension was thick, pressing on every heart. That night, the girl dreamed again. The Virgin Mary stood before her, clothed not in stone, but in light, her eyes gentle, her hands extended. She didn't speak, but the girl felt warmth, as though her fears and loneliness were being gathered up and soothed. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears. She didn't remember crying. By morning, whispers had turned into arguments. Was it miracle or madness? Coincidence or calling? The girl herself didn't argue. She simply returned to the statue, sitting beside it as though keeping watch. Whenever someone asked why she stayed there, she gave the same answer, simple and unwavering. "She came back because we forgot her." The words lingered, unsettling those who doubted, comforting those who believed. And for the first time in years, the village could no longer hide from the question pressing in from all sides. Was this accident or a message waiting to be found? It began quietly, without ceremony, as miracles often do. One afternoon, a mother arrived at the field carrying her little boy in her arms. He had been sick for weeks, his body frail, his face pale with fever. The doctor from the nearby town had prescribed medicine, but nothing seemed to help. The villagers whispered prayers for him, but many secretly feared the boy would not survive the month. The mother was exhausted, her eyes hollow, but there was something fierce in the way she clutched her son. She walked straight to the statue, past the villagers who lingered nearby, and lowered herself to her knees. "Please," she whispered, rocking the boy against her chest. "Please, don't let him go." Her words were not shouted, not desperate in sound. They were desperate in weight. They carried years of hope and fear, carried across the cracked soil to the Virgin's stone ears. The boy stirred faintly, his eyes fluttering open. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the folds of the statue's robe. For a moment, nothing happened. The mother bowed her head, her tears wetting the earth. But then the boy's hand grew steady. His fingers, once weak, curled around the stone. His breathing, shallow for weeks, deepened. His eyes opened fully, clear for the first time in months. The mother gasped, pulling back to look at him. "Matteo?" she whispered. "I'm not tired anymore," the boy said, softly sitting up in her arms. A hush fell over the field. The villagers who had been watching leaned closer, their hearts pounding. Some crossed themselves, others stared, mouths open, unwilling to believe what their eyes were telling them. By evening, the story had spread. Matteo, the boy who could barely walk for weeks, was seen running across the square with other children, laughing as though nothing had ever been wrong. His mother wept openly, declaring it was Mary's hand that had healed her son. Not everyone believed it, of course. The skeptic shook his head. Children recover. Fevers break. It happens all the time. Don't call it a miracle. But even he could not explain the timing, the sudden strength, the clarity in the boy's eyes. That same night, another strange thing happened. Villagers lit candles around the statue, their flames flickering in the evening breeze. One by one, people left, returning to their homes to rest. But in the morning, when the first light of dawn spilled over the fields, the candles were still burning, tall, whole, untouched by time. "Wax doesn't last like that," one woman murmured, touching the smooth, unmelted surface of a candle. "They should have burned out hours ago." "Perhaps she wants the light to stay," Father Miguel said quietly, lowering himself to his knees before the statue. By now, the little girl who had unearthed the Virgin was no longer simply curious. She was certain. Each night, her dreams grew stronger. And one morning, she told the villagers what she had seen. "She came to me again," the girl said simply, standing in the middle of the field as the villagers gathered around her. She said, "I was waiting to be found." The words struck through the crowd like lightning. Some wept. Others knelt without hesitation. Even those who had doubted felt their hearts tremble. "I was waiting to be found." It was not the words of a child. It was a message too heavy for such a small voice. That night, more villagers gathered than ever before. They brought flowers, rosaries, and songs. They lit candles not just at the statue's base, but along the paths leading to it. The square glowed in the darkness, a constellation of devotion. Prayers rose into the night air, carried on the wind. For the first time in years, the village was united, not in work, not in worry, but in faith. And as they knelt together in the flickering light, every heart, believer or skeptic, child or elder, felt the same thing pressing on their souls. This was no accident. What had been buried was more than stone. It was hope, waiting to be unearthed. And now the whole village had found it. They came at dawn, when the mist still clung to the fields. Cars rattled over the broken road leading into the village, not the village's old trucks or donkey carts, but unfamiliar vehicles that stirred up dust and curious stares. Word of the discovery had spread beyond the valley. First whispers in nearby markets, then a photograph passed from phone to phone, until the story traveled far enough to catch the ears of those who made a living chasing mysteries. Journalists stepped out first, lugging cameras and tripods, their jackets too fine for the dirt beneath their feet. They scanned the field like predators searching for prey, eyes sharp, voices brisk. "Where is it?" one asked, impatient, as though the miracle itself should present on command. Behind them came a group of skeptics, professors from the city, curious but already dismissive, their notebooks ready to explain away whatever they saw. "Folklore," one muttered under his breath. "These stories always turn out to be." And last, almost reverently, came two church officials, older men in dark robes, carrying themselves with the gravity of those accustomed to weighing miracles against doctrine. They did not rush, did not speak loudly. They simply walked with quiet eyes, measuring each step as though the earth itself might whisper to them. The villagers gathered nervously, pressing close to one another, guarding the statue that had become their anchor. Children peeked out from behind their mother's skirts, and the little girl who had found Mary clutched the hem of her dress, her eyes unblinking. "There," Father Miguel said softly, pointing to the flat stone where the Virgin rested. The journalists rushed forward, snapping photos. Cameras clicking like locusts. Flashes lit the statue in harsh bursts of white. "Just stone," one muttered, after lowering his lens. "Weathered, yes, but nothing unusual." The skeptics leaned in closer, tapping the base with pens, running fingers over the folds of her robe. "Preserved by the soil," one declared. "Common enough. Natural phenomenon." But the church officials knelt. One of them crossed himself, lips moving in silent prayer. The other traced the outline of Mary's face, his expression unreadable. The villagers bristled under the dismissive tones of the outsiders. A mother spoke up, her voice trembling with frustration. "Tell me then, how do you explain my son? He was dying. He touched her, and now he runs with the other children." She gestured toward Mateo, who darted across the field chasing butterflies, his cheeks flushed with health. The skeptics exchanged looks. "Children recover, fevers break, medicine works." "And the candles?" another villager demanded. "They burn all night, but the wax never melts." "Faulty candles, impurities in the wax. Nothing divine." The crowd's murmur grew restless. Believers clenched their rosaries tighter. Doubters smirked, ready with answers for everything. Then, just as the argument threatened to boil over, a shadow passed overhead. One by one, heads tilted upward. A flock of white birds circled above the field, wings flashing in the morning sun. They did not drift with the wind. They hovered, turning in a slow, perfect spiral above the statue, as though drawn to it. "Coincidence," one of the professors muttered, scribbling in his notebook. But even his voice faltered, cracking under the strain of disbelief. The villagers gasped again, for in that moment a fragrance swept across the field. Roses, sweet and fresh, carried on air that had no flowers to give it. Mothers inhaled sharply. Men glanced around in confusion. Children closed their eyes, smiling at the perfume that lingered though no roses grew within miles. "Smell is memory," a skeptic insisted, though his face betrayed his unease. "Your minds are playing tricks." But the little girl stepped forward, her voice steady, though her body trembled. "It's her," she said. "She's here." And then came the lights, faint, flickering, like fireflies, though it was too early in the season. Tiny glimmers appeared near the statue's base, darting and shimmering before vanishing into the air. The villagers dropped to their knees. Even Father Miguel pressed his forehead to the ground, whispering prayers with tears in his eyes. The journalists lowered their cameras, stunned into silence. The skeptics shifted uncomfortably, their arguments withering on their tongues. Only the church officials remained still, their eyes fixed on the Virgin, as though listening for something no one else could hear. No explanation could cover everything now. Flowers blooming in barren soil, candles refusing to melt, a child healed, birds circling, roses where none grew, lights where none belonged. And yet the question still lingered in the air, pressing heavy on every heart. Believer, doubter, visitor, child. How much proof is needed before doubt gives way to belief? The villagers could not leave the statue in the field forever. After weeks of gathering in the dirt, praying by lantern light, and defending it from doubters, they decided to bring the Virgin Mary to the heart of the town, to a place where she could watch over them all. The men fashioned a wooden cart strong enough to hold her weight, while women wove garlands of flowers to drape around her. Children walked barefoot in the dust, their hands carrying candles, their faces glowing with pride. And at the very front of the procession, small but determined, walked the little girl who had first unearthed her. She clutched a single rose in her hand, her eyes never leaving the statue as it was lifted onto the cart. They carried her through the winding streets, past crumbling houses, past the market stalls where whispers of doubt had once thrived. Doors opened, curtains fluttered. One by one, villagers stepped outside to watch. Some knelt as the statue passed, making the sign of the cross. Others simply stood still, their hearts tugged by something they could not name. The cart stopped in the village square, the same place where generations had gathered for weddings, festivals, and funerals. At its center stood the ruins of an old chapel, half collapsed, long abandoned. Stone walls jutted up like broken teeth, but the foundation still held. It was here the villagers chose to place her, not hidden in the earth, not lost to memory, but raised once more, where all could see. They set the Virgin Mary carefully upon a stone pedestal, the garlands draped across her shoulders, the candles flickered at her feet, and the rose the little girl had carried was laid gently in her hands. When Father Miguel stepped forward to bless her, his voice broke. "You were lost," he whispered, his eyes wet. "But you have come home." From that day forward, the square changed. Pilgrims began to arrive, first from nearby villages, then from towns farther away. They came quietly, without fanfare, carrying flowers, rosaries, and scraps of paper on which they had written prayers. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation, but many left with tears in their eyes. The villagers who had once doubted were now the caretakers, sweeping the square, lighting candles at dusk, arranging the endless bouquets left at her feet. Mothers who had once quarreled now prayed side by side. Farmers who had kept to themselves now shared food with the pilgrims. Old grudges faded, replaced by a shared reverence that no one could explain, but none could deny. And through it all, the little girl remained at the center. She did not claim to be special. She did not ask for recognition. But everywhere she went, people whispered, "She is the one who brought Mary home." She grew quieter in those days, her innocence carrying a weight far greater than her years. But when asked, she always said the same thing. "I wasn't looking for her. She was looking for us." The statue stood as more than stone. It was memory returned, faith renewed, mercy made visible. The village, once divided and weary, now carried itself differently, not with pride, but with hope. And in the evenings, when the candles flickered and the fragrance of roses filled the air, even the most stubborn doubters found themselves bowing their heads. The story spread far beyond their valley. Some came to mock, some came to measure, but all left changed. For in the square of a forgotten village, faith had been unearthed by the hands of a child. She thought she was digging for fun. Instead, she unearthed faith itself. If this story touched you, share it, because sometimes miracles come through the hands of a child.